Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong With the podcast. Today, we're happy to be speaking with Kellie Wagner. Kellie is a speaker, practitioner, and founder of the industry-leading diversity, equity, and inclusion consultancy Collective. Motivated by her experiences as a Black woman in tech, Kellie spent nearly a decade innovating DEI council and ERG strategies before launching her own consultancy in 2017. Since then, Collective has grown into a diverse team of DEI practitioners, spearheading inclusive workplace cultures and policies for millennial-driven brands like Spotify, Glossier, and Food 52. Kellie's thought-leading work on inclusive recruiting, intersectionality, and mental health has been featured in Forbes, GQ, and New York Magazine, and she has been a featured speaker at places like Culture Amp's Culture's First Conference, HR Redefined, the Muse, and the Wing. She's a graduate of NYU's Managing Workplace Diversity and Inclusion program, holds an MFA from the New School, and sits on the board of Experience Camps, a grief camp for kids who have experienced a loss. She currently lives and thrives in LA. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our podcast. Today, we have the great pleasure of speaking with Kellie Wagner. Kellie is the founder of Collective, which is a diversity, equity, and inclusion lab. Kellie, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me.
We're so looking forward to this conversation. Before we jump into everything, please tell us more about yourself.
Sure, yeah. Um, as you mentioned, my name's Kellie Wagner. I am a former tech, former branding and marketing professional turned company culture, diversity, equity, and inclusion strategist. And about 4 years ago almost 2000 late 2017 I started my company Collective, really to solve for one of the biggest problems and barriers that I saw for people who have been traditionally marginalized or oppressed in the American culture. Um, the biggest barrier for them in having a successful, healthy, meaningful career, which is just a lack of inclusion, a lack of access to sort of an experience of dignity, of empowerment in the traditional workplace. And so, really took a lot of the kind of things that I've always been interested in, skills that I picked up along the way through the tech industry around design thinking, around user experience, to set out to sort of solve this problem by collaborating with the people that are most impacted, right? The employees from those backgrounds in organizations, and really working with them to partner with leadership teams to design solutions that allowed them to thrive at work similarly to folks who have these identities that are more present traditionally in these workplaces.
Um, we're so passionate about everything around inclusion, but I would love to kind of like drill in deeper into something that you see as a workplace experience. In your letter on your website, you talk about like how you bounced off from many jobs, and then that obviously doesn't make you a great job candidate when people are hiring. But you thought it was maybe about you, which is very interesting. And then you kind of then, when talking to more people in these like marginalized communities, you're recognizing that, well, wait, maybe this is not about me. Maybe this is more about the workplace itself. Um, can you talk a little bit more about that, like some of your experiences or what you're hearing? Because I don't think, and we often say, um, like there is a problem in
Yeah.
workplace, and there has been even more of a problem maybe like a couple years ago, and thankfully we're hearing more of a conversation around it in the past couple years. We just need to see more action. But I think sometimes what I feel like there's this like overarching terminologies or statements happening, but not necessarily like we did this wrong. This was
Yeah.
not correct. So
Yeah.
can you talk a little bit more in depth about that workplace experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like to start out by just acknowledging the factors that have led us to this place, because some would say, well, the workplace was there's not a problem, right, in the way that the workplace was designed when it was designed. Like when we went through industrialization, when, offices were starting to office places, became more of a central part of an employee's life. Um, the workforce looked very different then. And really, what we're seeing is that the workplace hasn't evolved as the demographics of the workplace have. So it hasn't kept pace. So, you think about something as simple as air conditioning, this idea that like women are always cold in the workplace. Well, that's because when air conditioning temperatures, like that norm for what were set, were kind of created, that standard was created, the workplace was mostly men, and men tend to run a different temperature than women in general, right? So using that, example, you start to see how as more women, as more people of color, as sexual orientation became more less of a kind of secret and more integral and kind of out in people's lives. Um, you know, as we saw this shift, what we started to see was, oh, wait, the workplace was designed for one very specific type of person. And a lot of the things that then benefited that type of person actually don't benefit people. And so you start to see this disparity in who's able to be successful, right? Who's set up for
Yeah.
success because the workplace, whether it is the physical environment, whether it is policies, around working hours, and how people manage even, um, is
Yeah.
really designed to benefit one specific profile, and that's typically an able-bodied white man. And so I think that's one factor, right? Is just the shifting demographics. The other is shifting expectations for the workplace. When I was a kid, my parents went to work and then they came home, and that was it, right? Like
Yeah.
they weren't working necessarily anymore. Now they were home. And even before the pandemic, I think we've seen with just the integration of the internet being such a driver in the workplace now, and cell phones, people are connected, they're working more, they're expected to be on and connected to work more. And so you have this new generation, Gen Z emerging into the workplace, millennials, and their expectations. They're having this kind of collective awakening saying, hey, we spend so many waking hours of our lives at work. We want to work at a place that gives us a sense of meaning, that respects us.
Yeah.
And also, I think, this is the evolution of the parenting style of you matter, your feelings matter,
Yeah.
coming to fruition, right, as this generation comes into the workforce and has very different expectations. And then the last piece, I think, that has impacted this kind of idea that there's a problem that exists is that I think we're seeing this realization, and I would say, you look back over the past decade or two, with just um, I say identity politics, and I think sometimes that has like a negative connotation, but like identity politics and how people are aware, we've moved from like this idea that I was raised with like being colorblind, to like really seeing the impact of things like race and gender be acknowledged as being very front and center and integral to people's lives. And recognizing that all of these things that have been really had a huge impact on people's lives sociopolitically that have been happening, it's really hard to expect people to keep that separate, right? I think
Yeah.
we're having this newfound understanding that, you know, it's unrealistic to say, this thing that happened outside of the workplace, you're able to sort of shut it off when you come into the workplace, and the way that the news cycle is ever present and pervasive, and we're seeing more, uh, we are impacted in a different way because we're seeing people who look like us on the news. We're seeing those struggles. We're more aware of these things happening through these cultural movements. I think that, again, coupled with the millennial and Gen Z expectations about the workplace, that separation between home and work and your private life and your professional life are breaking down, and people want workplaces that are proactively going to address those things.
Yeah, oh my God, there's so many things I want to address here. And like first, like when you were talking about like the body temperature, I hate AC, by the way. And I was also thinking like I remember like how libraries are also like super cold all the time. So I'm like, okay, so we were also not expected to be in like libraries too.
Yeah,
So it like made me think of that. And it's the way you talk about it is so cool in the sense that, you know, the conversation that the fact that everything was designed for an able-bodied white man is a problem and it was wrong. But that's not the conversation. That's a whole other conversation that we can like drill into and like why that happened and why shouldn't have happened. But the thing that we need to like recognize and is happening is that um, things are shifting and our understandings are changing. And this, like as you said, is about work, how we work, what we expect from work, how we parent, how we interact with each other. Like everything is changing with everything out there, and potentially internet, social media, technology has a lot to do with all of those.
yeah,
So it's just that not addressing, that is like how, and it's very interesting, like I think we see this in systems design, we see this in product design, we see this in service design. Like we don't necessarily innovate much in or
yeah,
adapt much in any of these fields, right? We see, in our like in product landscape built environment, everything, not everything, but majority is still very inaccessible. We see, I think for like workplace environments, it's very normal for a woman to have a maternity leave and come back. But during that, like when they come back, what do you have in place to like support them? Potentially like
yeah,
very minimal. And, I think we see some push and change from maybe more younger companies, and especially
yeah,
companies that have a younger team base because the expectations and the demand from the employees are different. But we still very much see some old school ways of doing business and recruiting and hiring, and which, and especially I'm sure it, changes a lot based on state to state or city to city
yeah.
even. So the problem still maybe is as bad as how it was like many years ago, and in maybe in some places. But in some areas there is some intent to make a change. There is demand from corporations teams, and companies want to or now are trying to make their employees more happy than how they used to. And I think one silver lining maybe of last year was that it feels like it was the end of perfection as we know it, like we suddenly brought each other into our homes. And before like going into the filter backgrounds and blurring and whatnot, it was just a lot of shit show, excuse my language, but like it was everything on screen. If a toddler is running behind you is nothing like it was still a big worry for so many people, right? Like, oh, am I not professional? And I'm sure this was a little bit
Right,
more dominant with like the marginalized communities because they
right,
also have to perform more in their workplaces. So it but we kind of got used to that because we're human and we adapt, right? So now we don't necessarily expect the, perfect like workplace look. We don't judge someone if they show up like 2 minutes late, or we find it normal if we talk about like our life stuff when we start a conversation first. So it's sad that it took a pandemic to kind of like brought us to that place, but it also showed how quickly the mindset shift could happen. And companies were kind of like, oh, no, you can't work from home. You can't be flexible. And they're like, oh, wait, I guess
oh
you
wait.
can. So how do you see, and you explained kind of the demographic shift and our expectations or knowledge, like those growing, and therefore that calls for like change in workplace and corporate culture, really. How do you see kind of like last year's impact kind of evolving? Or do you personally experience that with everything that has happened since last year, there is more of a momentum of building around this?
Mm, I mean, these are such great questions. I think the um it's a mixed bag, right? I think there is a lot more momentum than there would have been otherwise, and it's interesting to um, see which areas people are excited to rush back to, which elements of the old way people are very eager to kind of return to if possible. And I think that varies from company to company. I recently spoke on a panel where there were three different leaders talking about their back to work. Or back to the office kind of plans and policies. And some people were like, no, like we need, I want to be back in the office, right? And others
Yeah.
are adapting to the reality that, there's actually benefits to this, but also there's a certain level of demand from their employees, right? And you talk about I think front and center recently, there's been the talk of kind of the great resignation. It's absolutely an employee's market, right? There's a lot of jobs that need to be filled. There's a lot of people quitting their jobs. I think the pandemic was a huge wake up call for people on how do I want to live my life? What's important to
Yeah.
me? And so I think there's a lot of companies that are sort of, I don't know if the momentum is, I think there's some ambivalence, right? There's a little bit of like, okay, we're doing this because we have to, not necessarily because we want to.
Right.
Um, but I will say that, again, I think, yes, the pandemic in some ways showed us what was possible, and also what was inevitable. So, what was possible in terms of, okay, like, yeah, we can work from home. We don't actually need to be in the office. We
Yeah.
can collaborate in these new ways that we thought, there's no way you could do a brainstorm if you aren't all in the room. And then in terms of inevitable, I think, having to address the very real impact that mental health has been playing on people's lives for a long time, but I think was certainly accelerated by this collective sort of need to adapt and be resilient,
Yeah.
at the society level in response to the pandemic, and just the weight that plays, or that has had on people's lives. But I think, when it comes to even diversity and specifically, um, I think it was almost impossible to ignore certain disparities that were easy to hide when we were in the office. So you talk about things like internet access. I remember when people were sort of at the beginning of the pandemic, business leaders and HR leaders were grappling with what does it look like to migrate an entire workforce to working at home. And
Yeah.
now we're finding, people have roommates, people are living in cramped quarters, people don't have access to Wi-Fi, steady Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
People are parenting and homeschooling their children, right? And all of a sudden you realize, oh, wait, we're not all equal. And some of us have very different stressors at home. And some of us, you know, they said, I remember, I think Madonna had said something like, we're all in the same boat with the
Oh my
pandemic.
God.
And people were saying, well, some of us are floating along in like a luxury yacht, and some of us are like,
Yeah.
paddling on in a tiny like you know canoe or whatever. So I think
Yeah.
I think that that when we had to work from home, it put it in, I mean, it put it in business owners faces. Yeah, my employees all have very different experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. And recognizing that is one thing. And then how do we act on this and make it more equitable is another. And I think we still have a long road to go in there. But I
Yeah.
think that, like, big like slap to our faces, really, was just because of this like sudden shift, right? And
Yeah.
it's kind of like you wish it didn't take that for this to happen, and you're kind
Right.
of glad that it happened at a time where, you know, mental health, like exhaustion, mental exhaustion has been um, very prominent for like
Yeah.
potentially many years now, but maybe it wasn't even like enough of a conversation all around.
I
So
think it was interesting. I mean, like it was interesting to see even the conversation in the diversity and inclusion space shift with the pandemic. So, I think two things happened in 2020 that shifted the conversation. Pre 2020, pre pandemic, when people came to Collective, came to me to talk about, diversity efforts, I would say the overwhelming kind of identity focus was gender. How do we make the
mm,
workplace more gender inclusive? We work with a lot of tech companies, so overwhelmingly male workforces. Um, we've got to address the gender disparity. And then the pandemic hit, and this conversation around mental health became the focus. And I thought it was really
absolutely.
interesting because one of the things that we see consistently in the data when we do assessments around the impact of identity um, on people's experiences in the workplace is that one, and this tracks with like the general population, is that about 25 to 30% of employees on average are experiencing a mental health condition. So we're
Mm,
talking about, a significant portion of your workforce who's having these experiences on a good day, right? Pre-pandemic.
yeah,
And we were not, and no one was coming to us saying, how do we support our employees around mental health? But because the pandemic sort of pushed people to that breaking point, it I think expanded the percentage of people who were experiencing acute mental
yeah,
health issues. All of a sudden, that became something that is actually a diversity and inclusion topic. Similarly with George Floyd, no one was coming to me talking about we need to talk about race specifically in the workplace. I almost feel like race in many ways, despite being one of the more kind of obvious and in your face um, issues in this
yeah,
country, was sort of we don't talk about that in corporate diversity and inclusion work because it's so heated, it's so uncomfortable. We don't want to go there. And I mean, similarly, it was sort of like, well, when it's put in your face in that way, it becomes impossible to ignore. And I think,
yeah,
because people were at home because of the pandemic, because people were glued to their TVs, because there was sort of this powder keg already building up. I
yeah,
think it just galvanized something that I don't know if the George Floyd murder had happened during not during a pandemic, if it would have
yeah.
had the same kind of impact that it had.
That's such a good point. And I was going to bring that up in terms of like, we actually experienced two crises in 2020, right? And one being around Black Lives Matter, which Black Lives Matter was, you know,
It's
a
been around.
conversation for like
Yeah,
many, many years. And to your point, because we were in the midst of this, well, like also our like glasses are full, like any other like negative news, we were just gonna like explode.
yeah,
And it was, we were also more present, like we were more in the moment and tuned in, I think, like with ourselves, and kind of like realizing, well, wait, like not everything is about the work and how they want to work and how we are at work and all of that. And so the timing of that also, and you're so right in the sense that like that slap in the face, well, I think there were like multiple slaps in a year about that subject, but like last year it really hit everybody.
yeah,
And not, and you know, there was this like big conversation around silence, which I think was actually explored and discussed for the first time, like the discomfort you're talking about. I think the first time I was like recognizing, well, wait, like now there's a conversation about embracing that discomfort and realizing that you might mess up, but you should do something about it anyway. And the best way to do it actually is then you have to actually collaborate with the community to be able to do so. But I think what's interesting is that, and then we've been seeing like, and there's also a huge like gap in the design industry and architecture industry. Like we don't see Black people in like events, and then like representation doesn't mean diversity either. Like you can't have one person in the room and say that we're very diverse too. So we started to see a little bit of that. But I think what's interesting is that this like bigger conversation around that representation is also not enough. That was actually triggered by last year. And it's very interesting how seeing corporations and even tech companies, I think, well, it's interesting because tech companies, like no other industry innovates in their level, right? But at the same time, because they move so fast, so many things are being built with so much mistake and bias and whatnot. And by the time you're like $1 billion company, you're like, oh wait, that was all wrong. So like it's very, so in different ways, all industries are kind of just reactive. Something happens, there is more demand, people are not pleased with this anymore. Okay, we need to change. But very few brands are proactive in setting things right.
You had said something like a while ago that actually made me think of this idea of kind of universal design. So if you think about architecture, and it's interesting because I think that we are still, when you say reactive, the way that we've seen this idea of kind of inclusion and equitable solutions, whether it's in product, whether it's in architecture, whether it's, in workplace design, is we build something the way we've always built it, and then
Exactly.
as an afterthought, if someone speaks up and says, hey, this isn't accessible to me, if there's enough people speaking up, then we'll say like, okay, well, I guess this is worth it for us to
Yeah.
sort of create an addendum, if you will. And that is how, when you look at accessibility, even in buildings, how that was treated, right? Is you build a building and then you have someone who's in a wheelchair become part of the kind of community or the
Yeah.
part of the audience that's using that building, and you say, oh, retroactively, hey, we need to build a ramp, right? And this idea of universal design is that when you are conceptualizing the building, when you're
Yeah.
conceptualizing the space, that you are conceptualizing it with this question of, how do we make sure the most types of people can utilize it effectively? And so
Yeah.
as you're building with inclusion and equitable access in mind.
Exactly.
And very few companies, well, one, it's like once you're a 100-year-old company, that's not really possible,
You're
right?
like,
Like you
wait,
can't,
what?
that's not accessible, right? It's not like you're going to scrap every single policy that you've ever had,
Yeah.
or and start from scratch. So that makes it difficult for companies, bigger companies, to adapt.
Yeah.
But even the startups that are just starting out, and we have companies who come to us and they say, look, we're 15 people, we're 20 people. We want to do this right from the start. We don't want to look back and say, oh, now we're a team of, you know, 30 men,
Yeah.
and how do we get women, right? It's actually
Yeah.
much harder at that point, because it's like, who wants to be the first woman to join this team of 30 other guys and be like, okay, here I am twiddling my
Exactly.
thumb. So, and I think that's really admirable that business owners, founders are starting to think that way. And like you said, especially in tech,
Yeah.
there's this desire to move really fast. And unfortunately, yeah, when you're designing with one type of person in mind, you can move really quickly. All you have to do is ask, especially if you
Exactly.
have them on your team, you ask that one person, what do you want
Next to
out of
you.
a
Yeah.
wallet, right? Like, what do you want out of the building? But
Yeah.
when you you are starting and you're like, okay, we want to think about this from all angles, it takes more time, takes more thought. And I think that while people like that idea in theory, they find moral righteousness in doing it that way. When it comes down to it, it's hard, and people don't necessarily want to put in that work, especially if there is a world and an audience out there that will accept what they're building without having to do extra work.
Yeah. And I think, industries that lag, like built environment, right? I think that's very, like we've been, and similar to you, I think inclusive design, universal design has been something we've been talking about for the past 6 years, since like basically we founded. And I think there's like, we've been working on so many more inclusive design projects since last year. And you've kind of see, and none of them still are in architecture. Interestingly enough, like I think this goes back to representation doesn't necessarily mean inclusion. Just because we have ADA doesn't mean buildings are accessible or public spaces are accessible. So there's like big settlement around, oh, but everybody else does this, and a lot of benchmarking against like already, old school methodologies. And also demand. I think what was interesting last year, even real estate developers, they were kind of like, well, wait, I guess we have to think about interior design a little bit more. Now that people are spending more time at home, everybody was a little bit more conscious about the sunlight that their apartment is getting, or whether they have a balcony or better windows, or whether they're seeing green. And I think it was the first time ever we saw developers kind of being open to collaborating on new ideas. Implementation is a different thing, but I guess that like openness. And I think we have to kind of see that more and more, because to your point, we have post occupancy studies in built environment. Like it's already kind of like, oops, what did we do wrong here? And maybe in the next one we don't do that. Whereas, so in all the inclusive design projects we're working on are either in product or service design. So, but that's still necessary, because that push needs to start from like one industry to sort of also like influence others. And I think what we've also seen, to your point, like when we're working with these 100-200-year-old corporations, like you can't obviously be nimble about, like you have to be reactive, and that reaction even probably lags, right? Like because moving a big ship takes a while. But we've seen, and we worked on a project with a very quick timeline last year that became a very successful example of inclusive design and product landscape. Larger corporations working with more nimble teams outside of their organizations, and recognizing that there's value in that collaboration. And it's almost like partnering up with incubators or just like smaller teams who just can be more agile. That is the way to go about. And I think what you were mentioning earlier about the sort of the I guess the movement of entrepreneurship, like people quitting their jobs to start their own business, there could be a potential future where we see corporations really collaborating with diverse small businesses, enabled to be reacting, but also being proactive about some real like crises that are hitting our societies and environment. And I don't know if like that was my kind of like, okay, people are definitely more open to collaboration. That was like one thing that we saw, and potentially that is the way that we can actually like address this more quickly. If we wait for policy, it's gonna like take it next generation, and then if we wait for like corporations to respond, things will lag.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's actually a really interesting solution that is and could continue to be put forth. And I think the success of it definitely hinges on how do these big corporations build trust with marginalized communities, with smaller, with these folks that have the insights, have the agility to kind of
Yeah.
create solutions that they're kind of larger bureaucratic teams really aren't able to execute on as quickly, and with the right insight. And I think that that is the work of these big corporations, right? Is to and we saw this, I think, last year, with big corporations making this sort of grandiose pledges and commitments towards fighting racial justice and things like that. And so then
Yeah.
looking a year out at, okay, well, what was the follow up of that? What, or follow
Yeah.
through for those initiatives? How did they partner with community partners that actually have the on the ground, kind of knowledge and experience? And I would say it hasn't gone as great, I think, as people hoped.
For
And,
sure.
there's room to continue to work on that. But I think that it can be very easy for these big corporations to say, well, I hold the purse strings. Um, to have sort of some hubris about it, like you're getting the opportunity to work with us versus
Yeah.
actually we need you
Yeah.
to be able to
Yeah.
stay relevant. We do
100%.
need that level of innovation.
Exactly, exactly. And I think also like going to the table, recognizing the trauma and distrust of all those like community-based organizations or directly communities. Like they have a
Yeah.
million reasons to not trust you, right? And you
Trust.
have to accept that, recognize that, and try to empathize on that before you even start a conversation. I mean, the trauma, and I think this is also like something like really quick, I would love to hear your thoughts on. We had an episode with Antoinette Carroll, which was a fascinating conversation, and she was talking about, I mean, sharing our trauma and things that happening in our communities is one way to raise awareness and educate and get everybody into the same mindset. In the meantime, that constant sharing and exposure to that
The trauma.
trauma, that's more trauma for the community itself. And so it's very interesting. Like, we want to hear examples of what happened or seeing on TV. Like, we feel like, okay, like, glad someone's shedding light on this, like, we will share the story. But it creates such trauma to those communities who then, like, even, like, as a like new mom, if you hear the traumatic experiences of all new moms like back to work, you're gonna be like dreading it and have major anxiety about going back to work. Think about like people dying on TV, and you're
Right.
like, well, like, can I actually walk by a police station? Like so big. And that was, for me, it was such a big oh moment actually, because I've been very big on like awareness, which is like a very one-sided like conversation on my end, right? And suddenly I was like, well, wait, but then how do you, like, there are ways to do that without. So what are some ways you feel like to do it in a way that works for everybody when
Yeah.
these changes are happening? We're not necessarily trying to educate one party by further traumatizing the other. How do you think like we get around that?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question, and I know that it's challenging because it's a balancing act, right? Storytelling,
Yeah.
is a very compelling way to galvanize people to take action. And I think, when I think about communal trauma, um, what and you listen to people around, like, okay, you know, what are the biggest challenges around sharing these stories? It's that so often, even after tons of sharing, no action takes place, no change takes place. And so if you feel like the sharing of your stories is almost like gratuitous, you're being
Yeah.
asked to share these stories over and over and over again, and you're not
And
seeing
nothing
the
happens.
actual impact of taking on that kind of emotional labor. Then it does start to feel like, okay, well, this is just sort of sadistic, in a sense, because there's no value in me doing it, and yet I'm still being asked to do it over and over and over again. So I think that there's a very big difference between asking someone to recount their trauma than having that be heard and
Yeah.
having, action taken. I mean, when you think about testimony, when folks, testify in court to that, and then to have that justice seen through, that can actually be a very cathartic experience. I shared my story and I saw justice
Yeah.
happen, versus I shared my story and then I share my story again, and then they ask me to share my story again, and then nothing
Yeah.
changes, right? So I
Yeah.
I I almost sometimes question, is it the asking to share the story that's traumatizing, or is it the being asked to share the story and still seeing that story almost be ignored,
Mm,
and yet having people come back and ask you to continue to reshare it?
yeah.
And I think that was, obviously the outcome of the conviction of George Floyd's murder, was had a certain level of cathartic, you know, ness to it,
Yeah.
but it was like, did it really take the world seeing that to have action come of it, right? And so
Yeah.
also thinking about what level of extremity has to be present for someone to say, this is okay, we believe you, right? Like, we see it
Yeah.
now, we have that awareness. And I think that's where some of that kind of re traumatization can stem from as well.
Yeah. And I think all like corporations, and this is for like workplace and also approaching collaboration, really need to understand there are a million reasons why the party you're approaching to work with may not trust you. And it's your job to, kind of have a build an understanding around all the biases, prejudices, distrust, and all of that, and start creating solutions around those first, maybe even before
Before
even talking
entering,
about, yeah,
and that is, it's interesting. A specific kind of example of that comes to mind for me is, I talk about this with recruiters that are trying to build more diverse employee
yeah,
pipelines, and or candidate pipelines. And they talk about kind of reaching out, their anxiety about reaching out to, community partners that might have access to this talent. And sometimes they talk about just not getting a positive reaction from these folks. And I say to
and you're
them,
like,
like, okay, but
oh,
when you're
really?
weird, when you're approaching, a partner, a community, etc., that you've done nothing for, and then you come to them with this sort of transactional ask, send us your people. And and even more insultingly, it's veiled as, we're going to help you, you know? It's
Oh
like,
my
well, of
God.
course they're not going to trust you. And so I always, one of the things that I advise in those situations is, I'm like, before you ever even looking for candidates, before you even approach them about, hey, do you have any candidates, reaching out to and thinking about what can you offer them, right? So
Yeah,
is it, hey, we'd love to just offer like free mentor or resume reviews for your community, or free kind of career coaching, etc. How can we partner to be of service to your community? What do you need that we could potentially provide, right? And I think that is that entry point into, okay, now invest the time into building a relationship of trust, of like mutual goodwill, before you start coming into these communities trying to essentially reap some sort of value out of them.
right. Right. And it's funny you mentioned, we've been recently working on a project where, for a governmental agency that wanted to kick off more of a system, I guess, that is collaborative with community-based organizations. And as we're having this like co-creative process, what we were discovering is that, you know, none of them want to share their community or want them to be interviewed. And that was kind of for us like a mega insight immediately, right? Like, hey, they don't trust you. And then sort of like having them accept that. But almost we found ourselves like the mediator in the situation. And this like goes back to, again, collaborating with like agencies that actually have like their business around the mission that could, and these are like smaller agencies, right, and could build trust with other like parties maybe more easily, and then you become the mediator, kind of like helping that like common way. That could be one way, like we thought the way to get around that, and that where we found ourselves be really to try to understand, like, okay, you don't want to talk to them, so like we can talk to them on behalf of you, like really advocacy work in the middle. And but and we it was a very cool team. We were working with the agency and they totally accepted that. But there is some to your point, like still trying, like, oh, like they were not responsive, or you're like, wow, that's shocking. I wonder
Surprise,
why.
surprise.
Exactly. So I think that, and this is why, I love collective, and I think it's an understatement for like any like organization that is trying to genuinely, or the intent at least is to create like some genuine shift in their own like culture. They can't do it alone, and they really need the support of companies like yours that really can not only like show them a way and strategy, but also like have that like advocacy position, even if like
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah, that
um
rebuilding the trust. I mean, that's what you were talking about. That's so often the role that we do have to come in and play,
yeah.
right? I mean, I think there are companies that are like, why can't we just survey our own team and like we can run our own focus groups? And I'm like, it depends. There are companies where they can go around. I remember we worked with a company very early on in the trajectory of collective, and the CEO said, well, instead of, you all doing interviews, I'm going to do a sort of uh, CEO tour, right? Where I'm going to go and I'm going to like listen a listening tour. And I was like, I love the enthusiasm. I'm so glad that you're open to that. And, from the limited interviews we've done thus far, I don't think that there's a sense of trust and safety where they're going to be honest with you. And, that was really hard for him to accept because he said, it's my company. I can and I said, you absolutely can. And you
Oh
might
my
not get
God.
the information you're looking for because there's not that trust. And so a lot of times that is the role that we play, is how can we help these two sort of groups come together and rebuild a sense of trust that's going to set the foundation for them being able to do kind of culture shifting work effectively.
Yeah. Yeah. And knowing that it's going to move beyond like, we heard you, we're taking the right actions. I think that was the statement, right? I feel like there was a copy paste statement last year that was going around. Oh my God, Kelly, this was so good. Thank you so much for your time. I think we can talk about this subject all day, but I slowly want to wrap up. So one thing I do want to ask, clearly, in your field, what you're doing is not easy. And, you're not only like trying to create like change or like a shift in course for like one big ship. It's like multiple. So what would be your advice to anybody who's really trying to make progress and push boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is about looking at the being able to kind of zoom out and zoom in. Sometimes it can feel like this work, especially, changing culture, shifting human behavior takes time. And um, especially when you're working with people who are saying, I want to see results now, right?
Yeah,
Being able to zoom in enough to sort of pinpoint those small changes that are happening and celebrate those wins while also being able to zoom out, and look at the kind of long-term plan. I think in our culture of startups and innovation and fast-paced, change, um, this work is very antithetical to what we're used to. And so
yeah,
we often and this goes for any industry, right? It can often feel really good to take sort of like shortcuts or prioritize band-aids that can
yeah,
allow us to feel like we made progress, but actually are not leading to the outcomes that we actually want. So being
yeah.
able to balance those things so that you can keep the momentum while also um, really staying true to the outcome that you are ultimately seeking.
I love that so much. I was like saying the other day to someone that lesser bad is okay. but it can't be a permanent solution. We need to
Yeah.
recognize the greater good, right? So like in the meantime, in getting there, lesser bad is okay, but we need to aim for the greater good. So thank you so much, Kellie. This was such a treat.
My pleasure.
Any updates with like collective you want to share, or anything that we should be following that is coming out soon?
Yeah, so we actually have just launched a new series of trainings. We revamped our entire training series based on so much of the research we've gleaned over the past 4 years of training thousands of employees and really understanding what they need to feel like they can have positive, healthy interactions with their colleagues. I would definitely recommend checking it out. It is all very much based around giving people the skills and tools to create that trust, to repair relationships when we kind of inevitably get it wrong, and to start to feel more comfortable engaging with difference in our lives.
Oh, I love that so much. And where can we find those trainings?
You can check out our menu at hello-collective.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kellie. Thanks for making the
Thank
time today.
you. My pleasure.
And that is this week's episode of What's Wrong with the Podcast. To make sure you never miss an episode, subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other podcasting platform. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Links can be found in the episode description, and you can also find them on our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz. If you found value in the show, we would appreciate if you could rate us and leave a review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. Don't forget to join us next week. Thank you for listening.